All right, everybody. Welcome. It is my great pleasure, if the sun allows me. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the inaugural talk of the 2023 season of the VAMP Vanderbilt Modern Philosophy Spring Seminars. This is the third year in a row that we're able to continue this recent tradition. As you know, we began this in the midst of the pandemic as a means of keeping connected scholars who are passionate about modern philosophy across the world. And now, as we're hopefully heading towards less pandemic-y times, we still decided to keep this running online as we've made friends and connections all over the world. And it just feels such a wonderful occasion to connect and talk about and investigate about the things we're all passionate about. So our talk today, I'm very pleased that we will be hosting the first ever panel here at VAMP. For that reason, we're going to be a little longer than we usually are. As you know, we usually take about 1 hour and a half. Today, we might push more towards the 2-hour mark. But today's panel is going to be discussing Spinoza on Conatus, and we will be hosting Oliver Toth from University of Graz, Marie Wuth from University of Hamburg, and Luce deLire from Johns Hopkins University. So without taking up much of your time, I'm just gonna mute myself and leave the floor to the speakers. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I guess I'll be the first one. Thank you for turning out. This is already like a pretty good turnout for an event like this, I would think. What I want to do today is I want to give you a rough sketch of a few thoughts on Spinoza, freedom, and critique that are like following from the piece that I'm currently working on as my larger project currently that is hopefully coming to an end soon, is on Spinoza's Metaphysics of Infinity. And in this talk, I want to like draw some political conclusions from that work. So it's going to have like rough edges, but I thought I'd float these ideas to you and we can see what we do with it in the Q&A. I think my general idea here that I want to present is the following. It's been my impression as a piece of political analysis for a number of years now that we're basically facing the end of the age of critique. And the reason I believe that is that if we follow, or I would think that Foucault has a point by saying that the practice of critique comes together in the 15th, 16th century as a merging of power and knowledge. So like power styles itself based on or like backed up by legitimated by knowledge. So like that is a formation that I would for brevity call authority. So power plus knowledge is authority. And of course, like critique basically only makes sense as a means of political intervention in a situation where a change in knowledge is going to mean a change in power. So if you had the situation where power and knowledge did come apart and authority didn't have like the political credence or credit that it used to have in the last 300 years, then we would face tough times for critique. And I do think that in some parts of the Western world, we can see this actually happening. I think like we saw this very clearly with Donald Trump. We can see it with like other authoritarian, post-authoritarian, new authoritarian politicians. We can talk about it more. It has a lot to do with digitalization, et cetera, et cetera. But that's my starting point, so to speak. So my question is, what can critique be? What can critique do in a post-critique situation? And I do think that, or I would suggest to you today that Spinoza can help us with this, because I think that if I can motivate this properly, I hope that I can convince you that like Spinoza has a notion of what I would call the Spinoza sublime. It's an experience of infinity that is like built into Spinoza's philosophy, that can be a model for a kind of critique that does not first and foremost attack knowledge, but attacks on an affective level, but brings about the good nevertheless. So that's like the basic framing. And now I will try to like make sense of this and like stop like talking just like random political thoughts. And I thought I'd start. I'll do this by walking you through a little handout that I made, and I thought I'd start with with the definition of freedom. The definition of freedom in the ethics. This is definition 6, definition 7, and I put it here in the Latin because I think it like becomes clearer what I'm up to. So you may or may not know that the definition of freedom, that the thing is called free when it is determined to act out of its nature alone, and opposed to that, it is called coerced or necessary. We may have to like talk about this kind of necessity if it is determined by an external cause, so like by something else. So you can see already that like the whole notion of freedom or unfreedom hinges on a notion of determination, which I underlined here in yellow for you. So like if we want to like find out what it is to be free, we should probably ask what it is to be determinate. And there are two general directions that one can take. And the one direction is we understand determination as something negative, and the other one is to understand determination as something positive. I will now first argue against the first notion, determination as negativity, and then argue for the second one. There are, of course, passages that like seem to suggest that like determination is a kind of negativity, and that therefore freedom is an absence of this negativity. For example, letter 36, where Spinoza says determination is nothing positive, but only the privation of existence of the same nature, which is conceived as determinate, which leads Spinoza in letter 36 to understand God as something that is absolutely indeterminate, because all determinacy would be understood as deficiency. And of course, the famous, or infamous, I would say, should be infamous, notion in letter 50, determinatio negatio est, all determination is negation. So that seems to be very clear cut. It seems as though Spinoza would understand determination as negation. There's no doubt about it. And this freedom should be the absence of determination, or which is then understood as self-determination, which is the absence of like external causation. I will now try to convince you that that cannot be true. If we look, my first point of attack here is axiom 3. I also put it here in the Latin because I think it comes out more clearly. So in axiom 3, Spinoza says that from determinate causes, effects follow with necessity. So it's often people seem to be happy to overlook the determination in this axiom. So from determinate causes, effects follow with necessity, but inversely, when no determinate cause is given, no effect can follow. When no determinate cause is given, no effect can follow. Now, if letter 50 was correct and determination was negation, then of course God could not have any effects. The reason is that God would be a free cause, so a cause that like would be indeterminate, if we believe letter 36, God absolutely indeterminate. And consequentially, E1P11 and E1P7, which both argue that like God / substance cause themselves out of their own necessity, would have to be false. But that is not what Spinoza says. Spinoza clearly says in E1P11 that God causes herself by virtue of her own essence. But even if this doesn't convince you and you think there's like a way around it, I would like to suggest that it seems that to me that Spinoza makes a terminological shift between these letters, 36 and 50, and the ethics. Because if you look at this, this is 36, and you look at the definition of finitude in the ethics, looks very much the same. So here in letter 36, determination is the privation of the existence of the same nature. And in E1P8 as 1, it is the finite, which is the negation of the existence of some nature. And E1D2, which I'm not a fan of, but that can be, again, wait to later, says again that the finite is the termination, actually, interestingly, terminare is the Latin term, of something of the same nature. So it looks to me as though Spinoza might have understood determination as the absence of like existence of the same nature at some point, but then there was a need to a different term that would allow him basically to say what he says here, namely that it's a determinate cause. So my argument here is systematically, I think the negative reading doesn't fit this important axiom, and terminologically, I think you can see that there's a shift happening here. All right. A last argument against the negative reading would be that in P32D, Spinoza says that a will, whether it is conceived of as finite or infinite, requires a cause through which it is determinate. This, of course, would make no sense if determinate would mean a negation or like any kind of negativity, because it couldn't be an infinite will that would be negated into a particular way of functioning. So what is determination then? I want to suggest to you, did I not put this here? I want to suggest to you that actually determination is not inhibiting, but a qualification. And you can see this if you look at P29, I think. Where Spinoza says that it is clear in and of itself that the reason, that the cause that determines a thing is a positive thing and not a positive thing. Now, the thing that's causing is a positive thing, and the thing that is caused is also a positive thing. Consequentially, I don't see where the negation is supposed to come from. So it seems to me that determination is not inhibiting, but positively qualifying to do this or that. And this is interesting because there are like quite a bunch of like scholars. I can show you the references if you want to. For example, Materon in his commentary on in the Presse Universitaire de France edition, the new one, of the ethics, and Guru in his interpretation, in his often great book on Spinoza, but also Shannon Dia and Gila Kletenik on divine infinity. Okay, so now we are a little bit closer, I would think, to like what this like freedom here is supposed to mean. It is a qualified determination, like qualified making do. It is not an inhibition of any kind of any sort. So, so interestingly, if we look back at letter 36, where is it? Here. Where God was absolutely indeterminate, we now have to say, or we can see that God, of course, in the ethics is not absolutely indeterminate, because in the ethics, God is defined as absolutely infinite being. So in the ethics, God is not absolutely indeterminate, but absolutely infinite. And I now want to argue that it is exactly this determinate infinity that that we should understand as freedom, which applies to both God and particular things. So my argument is going to be that in order to be infinite, in order to be free, we need to be determinately infinite. I will now try and make clear to you what I mean by this. It is interesting, of course, like to look at how Spinoza uses the notion of freedom. And here is an example that I find particularly instructive from E3 P27 C3, where he says, as far as we can, we strive to free a thing we pity from its suffering, but we don't have to like give too much attention actually to like the affect theory context here, because the way in which he uses free in this context is pretty clear. This is the Curly translation. He says that thing which inhibits the thing that we pity should be destroyed. We shall be determined to destroy it, and so we strive to free the thing. So we should be, we are just determined to destroy something, and so we strive to free the thing. Here's the Latin text from the Puff edition. So we want to like just like take it away, the existence, or destroy it, which inhibits in a way the conatus, the striving of that thing which we pity, and that is our striving for it to be free. So here, the freedom is really the disinhibition of the conatus. But that does not mean that like anything is going to be indeterminate. That doesn't mean that anything is going to be like defined by negativity. It just means that like the conatus of a certain thing, the striving of a certain thing, can operate without external obstacle. So there's no indetermination here. It's just a differently qualified determination, which is a determination without external inhibition. Right. So this is what this looks like in practice, so to speak, the determination thing. And now, of course, this has everything to do with what an inhibition is and what a negativity is, what an absence is. So like, of course, the question is now, implicitly, I sort of have said that the conatus of a certain thing that is not free lacks power, or like lacks expression, or like lacks perfection, or like one of these terms that Spinoza uses in this context. And if you remember, if you look at like how Spinoza defines or like makes sense of negation or absence in E2P17, we can see what's going on here, because there he tries to get away from a notion of negativity that was like that was ontologically negative, because he thinks that negativity doesn't have, or negation doesn't have qualities, cannot be used. There's no ontological negativity. And so he understands absence as in a perspectivized way. So the Spinoza's idea in E2P17 would not be that a thing is absent in itself, but that it's always only absent to someone. So the idea is that like things that like are close to each other are present to each other. So like the mind of my left hand and the mind of my right hand now are present to each other, but they can also like not be present to each other, and then they will perceive each other as absent or negative. All right, so it's a relative negativity that he's talking about, and in this context, in the Scholium, he makes an interesting remark because he says, if the mind, while it imagined non-existent things as present to it, at the same time knew that those things did not exist, it would attribute this power of imagining to a virtue of its nature, its own nature. Not a vice, especially if this faculty of imagining depended only on its own nature. Interestingly, quoting the definition of freedom, if the mind's faculty of imagining were free. So there's a concept here of a free imagination that is not opposed to the imagination of non-existent things. So that means that it is not exposed to what we would maybe at first sight think of as a dysfunctional mind, or like a way of like a way of functioning of the mind that that is not adequate to like its present surroundings, or like to the things that are really there. But this kind of like functioning is itself a virtue, and we will see in a minute why he would think that. So there's a free mind here, a quality, a power of the mind to like imagine things that are not there. And this is what I would call the spinozistic sublime. Now, I told you that this is like coming out of my work on infinity. And I don't want to say about infinity too much, but like I think you can get an idea of what like this kind of infinity is and what this virtue it really is in E2P8C, where Spinoza talks about circles, geometric, simple geometric forms, and that says that the circle is of such a nature that the rectangles formed from the segments of all straight lines intersecting in it are equal to one another. Thus, in a circle, there are contained infinitely many rectangles that are equal to one another. So you have a circle and you have rectangles that like meet within it. And Spinoza says if you imagine only the circle, then there is no need to restrict the number of really any figures that will occur within the confines of that circle. There are infinitely many rectangles, but of course there are like also infinitely many circles in the circle, but there are also infinitely many ponies in the circle. There are also infinitely many dots in the circle, etc., etc. It just so happens that natures are indeterminate. Coming back to the question of indeterminacy, but a different indeterminacy, regarding the amount of stuff that like fits within them, into them. And I want to suggest that like it's exactly this. So the mind, the nature of the mind is not determined regarding the things that it can imagine, and if it is not inhibited, then it will imagine all kinds of things, but that is actually making it more powerful. I'll take another 2 minutes just to like come back to the critique issue. The question now is, so this is what I would call like a determinate in infinity, right? Like it's not like that, it's a free-for-all. And it's not that it is the absence of like real inhibition that like was this infinity. It's like still this particular mind that belongs to like this particular body, just as it's in the nature of a particular circle that rectangles can appear. So infinity here is not like the absolute infinity that like entails everything, although we would need to talk about that too. But it's a determinate infinity, in the sense that like the nature of a particular mind can imagine countless things. And I would think like this can lead to a sublime experience, to like an experience of like confrontation with infinity. He says as much basically in E5P5. Don't do this to me. Where he says that an affect towards a thing we imagine to be free is greater than towards a thing that that we imagine necessary. And this freedom is to imagine it simply without the causes that like actually bring about things that happen within it. So this is like, if we imagine the nature of the circle, we can imagine infinitely many circles within it, although there might also be only be three in a particular circle. So we ignore the causes. And the affect that we get from this, Spinoza thinks, is the greatest affect of all. Now, the political ramification of this is that like the affect that we get from like imagining something as free in this like sublime way, which I think is like articulated here, can of course conquer all other affects. And we know that like lots of like bad stuff that happens in society, such as superstition, hate against all kinds of people, fear, you know, all this stuff, it is generated by these affects of like weakness. But the free imagination, the sublime imagination, sort of, as it were, conquers them all. Spinoza tells us, and in this way, and then with this I will finish, and I hope I can gather all the questions that I left along the wayside in the Q&A. And in this way, I think we have a Spinozistic kind of critique, which does not inhibit thought. It doesn't tell you don't think this, but instead it is a critique of joy. Like it is a critique that like should joyfully have you distance yourself from these affects which are toxic in a certain human society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luce. I'm going to now invite you all to make notes of the questions, as we will move the Q&A at the end of all three talks, at the end of the panel. So, Marie, Oliver.
Yes, thank you. I'm the next one. And I hope you can see my presentation. So this is part of a project in which I try to develop a paper on privation and negation. And this connects to Luce's paper by developing the theme of how the Conatus is inhibited or not inhibited in Spinoza's philosophy. Recently, the interpretations of Spinoza's philosophy emphasizing the social constitution of the mind have gathered momentum. Martin Sarr's Immanenz der Macht explores the way in which affective and power dynamics of a society build the necessary backdrop of the constitution of human rationality and agency. Martin Lenz's Socializing Minds argues that human minds are essentially the space in which the power dynamics between ideas plays out. Both interpretations construe large parts of Spinoza's philosophy as an ideological critique debunking the myth of individual achievements and failures, merits and faults. Both interpretations emphasize that each human mind essentially is what it is in virtue of its social and affective context, which shapes the mind's behavior and beliefs in a way over which the mind has only limited control. In this paper, I would like to support this line of interpretation by focusing on two metaphors for sin used by Spinoza at different points in his career. I argue that there is an implicit shift within Spinoza's philosophy. Although Spinoza did, from early on, deny free will and thereby the notion that one could have decided otherwise, I argue that he only came to see evil as the effect of the social context later. I claim that this shift is reflected in his metaphors for the sinful person. Whereas in his early metaphysical thoughts, which was published in 1663, he compares the sinful person to a poisonous snake. In his late correspondence with Oldenburg, 1676, he compares the sinful person to a person bitten by a rabid dog. The shift in metaphors is significant, I claim. The poisonous snake is a perfectly viable form of life, even if it is unpleasant to us. It is not conceivable that the snake could do otherwise. It is in the nature of the poisonous snake to bite humans. By contrast, the person bit by the rabid dog is a deviation from a viable form of life, which is dangerous to others. Even if the concrete disease cannot be cured in this case, the metaphor suggests that it is not in the nature of the person that it is dangerous to us. It is dangerous to us because of its corruption through external causes. This indicates that it is conceivable that the given person could do otherwise. In the following, I briefly survey both metaphors in the respective contexts and then argue for the broader relevance of this shift. So the first one, in chapter 8 of the second part of the Metaphysical Thoughts on God's Will, Spinoza writes, quote, "You will ask again, why are the impious punished? For they act from their own nature and according to the divine decree. But I answer that it is also from the divine decree that they are punished. If only those were fit to be punished, whom we feign to sin only from freedom, why do men try to exterminate poisonous snakes? For they only sin from their own nature, nor can they do otherwise." End of quote. The context of this quote is Spinoza's discussion of the relationship between sin and punishment. In order to appreciate the import of Spinoza's example, we should briefly consider the traditional doctrine of privation and negation. According to Aristotelian metaphysics, each thing's essence determines the scope of properties which the thing necessarily has, naturally should have, possibly could have, and could not have under any circumstances. For example, in the case of human beings, rationality is a property that humans necessarily have, eyesight is a property that humans naturally should have, being able to read is a property that they can possibly have, and having gills is a property that they could not have under any circumstances. This metaphysical doctrine had implications for value judgments. Impossible and necessary properties are outside of the scope of moral judgment. No human being can be praised for being rational or blamed for not having gills. It is only the scope of possible properties which can be subject to moral evaluation. Spinoza's necessitarian metaphysics is in conflict with this conception of moral judgment. As Spinoza explains in his correspondence with Blyenberg in 1665, which is roughly from the same period as the Metaphysical Thoughts, the impious person has an essence from which her evil deeds necessarily follow, which is then punished by necessity. By contrast, the pious person has an essence from which her good deeds necessarily follow, which is then rewarded by the same necessity. Spinoza conceives of essences as singular and complete at this point. Each individual thing has its own unique singular essence, which necessitates every property of that thing and excludes all those properties that the thing could not have. That is to say, Spinoza explicitly denies that there would be a difference between lack of sight in a blind person and in a stone. Although the fallible human mind can more easily imagine that the blind person could see, in reality, both the blind person and the stone have essences that exclude the property of sight. In a similar manner, the sinful person's essence necessitates her evil deed and excludes any other deed. For example, it was just as impossible for Adam not to eat the apple as it would have been for the stone to see. The stone's essence excludes the property of sight the same way as Adam's essence excludes every deed other than eating the apple. As an adherent of the traditional philosophy, Blyenberg should ask the question of what makes a sinful action sinful if it is without alternatives. According to the traditional view, a sinful action is sinful because it is freely chosen by the subject. No human chooses to be rational or not to have gills. These are necessary properties. But some people will decide to commit adultery, whereas others decide not to. Being an adulterer is a possible property according to the traditional view. Spinoza rejects this view and argues that being an adulterer and being rational are both necessary properties of the adulterer. Rather than because of the choice, the sinful action is sinful because of its prudential consequences. As Spinoza's discussion of Adam's act of eating the apple makes it clear, Adam's act was sinful because its consequences were detrimental for him. Adam's act of eating the apple was not unlike someone's act of eating poison. It is not bad because it conflicts with someone's prescriptions, but because it conflicts with the agent's interests. Spinoza summarizes his view as follows. I value works by their quality and not by the power of the worksman, and the wages which follow from the work follow it as necessarily as from the nature of a triangle it follows that its 3 angles must equal 2 right angles. This description, combined with Spinoza's claim that the singular essence of each individual necessitates their deeds, indicates that the impious person has a nature that contains a lack of awareness of what would rationally serve her interest. Therefore, she necessarily engages in imprudent action through which she puts herself in danger. By contrast, the pious person has a nature that contains an awareness of what would serve her interest. Therefore, she engaged in prudent actions that served her well. In the case of Adam, although God presented him with the knowledge that eating the apple was a bad idea, Adam's nature was such that it lacked an appreciation for this knowledge and did not treat it as a reason against eating the apple. The punishment for this deed has followed by necessity, since Adam has poisoned himself. We should add that Spinoza's metaphor of the poisonous snake seems to fit uneasily into this framework, since the poisonous snake does not pose a danger to itself, but rather to the human community. However, the difficulty is merely apparent if we take into account Spinoza's discussion of metaethical terms in chapter 6 of part 1 of the Metaphysical Thought. There, Spinoza states that the good and bad are always relative to an appraiser. Applying this view to the discussion of sin, we could say that Adam's deed is bad for Adam, but probably good for the snake. In a similar manner, the poisonous snake's act of biting the human being is good for the snake and bad for us. By choosing the metaphor of the poisonous snake, Spinoza seems to be making 2 points. First, he seems to suggest that only sin that is dangerous to the community merits punishment over and above the act itself. If someone eats poison, it is bad for her, but it is her own business. If, however, someone spreads misinformation, that is bad for the whole community and might or might not be bad for her. Second, Spinoza argues that it is indeed possible to evaluate necessary properties in relation to one's goals and preferences. Even though it is in the nature of the poisonous snake that it bites humans, humans have every right to evaluate the existence of poisonous snakes negatively and exterminate them. This is because the poisonous snake's existence conflicts with the human being's goals and preferences. The poisonous snake presents a danger to human existence. And now I go over to the second metaphor. Spinoza turns back to the discussion of sin and punishment in one of his last letters. The context of his letter is Oldenburg's inquiry about Spinoza's theological political treatise. Spinoza tries to explain the compatibility of his determinism and morality in letter 78 as follows, quote, "But you insist if men sin from a necessity of nature, then they are excusable. But you don't explain what you want to infer from that. Is it that God cannot become angry with them, or that they are worthy of blessedness, that is to say, of the knowledge and love of God? If the former, then I grant completely that God does not become angry, but that all things happen according to his degree. But I deny that for this reason all men ought to be blessed. Indeed, men can be excusable and nevertheless lack blessedness and suffer in many ways. A horse is excusable for being a horse and not a man, but he must still be a horse and not a man. Someone who is crazy because of a dog's bite is indeed to be excused, nevertheless, he is rightly suffocated. And finally, one who cannot govern his desires and restrain them by fear of the laws, although he too is to be excused because of his weakness, nevertheless cannot enjoy peace of mind and the knowledge and love of God. He necessarily perishes." The context of this description is a series of questions posed by Oldenburg, which are not unlike Blyenberg's questions. Just as Blyenberg, Oldenburg also presupposes the traditional metaphysical framework, according to which moral evaluation presupposes the conceivability of doing otherwise, that is to say that there must be a modal difference between the way in which human beings lack guilt and the human being decides to do something. As we have seen, Spinoza explicitly denied this distinction in his metaphysical thoughts, with which many features of his answer to Oldenburg are in common. Both the metaphysical thoughts and his answer to Oldenburg argue that determinism is compatible with moral responsibility. Both construe the sinful action as a necessary consequence of the subject's constitution, and both construe the punishment of the sinful action in prudential terms. The first analogy of the horse might give the impression that Spinoza still construes sin as a consequence of the subject's nature. However, I argue that this is not what Spinoza means. Rather, he argues in 3 steps. In this context, I find it telling that Spinoza does not claim that men sin from the necessity of their nature, only that they sin from a necessity of nature. In the first step, Spinoza establishes the principle that what is traditionally taken to be a necessary property can be the source of negative consequences and thus the source of prudential punishment. Although it is in the nature of the horse that it cannot have knowledge of God, it must still suffer the consequences. In the second step, Spinoza establishes the claim that same applies to what is traditionally taken to be the lack of a natural property. They can also be the source of negative consequences and thus the source of prudential punishment. It is not in the nature of the human being to be infected with rabies, which therefore something that is explained by the impact of the external cause. In the third step, he concludes that sin is similar to this infection, and thus it can be the source of prudential punishment. That Spinoza saw the need to introduce the second step in his argumentation and could not immediately jump from the analogy of the horse to the discussion of sinful action indicates that there has been a fundamental shift in Spinoza's metaphysics. Unlike in the case of the metaphysical thoughts, where he construed sin as a necessary consequence of the subject's nature, in his letter to Oldenburg, Spinoza construes sin as the necessary consequence of a corruption of the nature of the human subject. This indicates that sin cannot follow from the nature of the individual. As we have seen in the metaphysical thoughts, Spinoza held that it followed from Adam's singular essence, that he did not appreciate some reasons, which led him to poisoning himself. In his answer to Oldenburg, Spinoza makes clear that the lack of appreciation is to be explained by the influence of external causes, rather than by the individual's nature. Sin is not simply construed as a natural property, conflicting with human preferences, but as a deviation from the nature of the human being. Probably everyone who is familiar with letter 78 is preparing to raise an objection at this point, since Spinoza seems to attribute sin to the individual nature of the human being in the paragraph just preceding the one I have quoted. As he writes, quote, "No one can reproach God because he hadn't given him a weak nature or a mind lacking in power. That would be as absurd as if a circle were to complain that God did not give it the properties of a sphere, or a child who is suffering from a stone that he did not give it a healthy body. Similarly, a weak-minded man can't complain that God has denied him strength of character and the true knowledge and love of God of himself, so that he cannot restrain or moderate his desires. For nothing else belongs to the nature of anything than what follows necessarily from its given cause." End of quote. Although the passage indeed looks very similar to the passage from the metaphysical thoughts, I argue that there are important differences. First, I would like to emphasize that there is a similar 3 steps argumentation as in the passage about the person bitten by the rabid dog. First, Spinoza discusses the nature of the circle, then he turns to the child suffering from a stone, and finally moves to the impious person. Again, Spinoza saw the need to introduce an intermediary step between the case when properties follow from the essence of the thing and the impious person. Second, Spinoza's characterization Spinoza characterizes impious behavior as the weakness of the mind, which is a term missing from the metaphysical thoughts and the Blyenberg correspondence. As Andrea San Giacomo has argued, Spinoza only introduced the notion of Conatus and abandoned ethical intellectualism after the Blyenberg correspondence. It is only after that correspondence that he realized one's rational convictions can be defeated by passions. I would argue that both these points matter because Spinoza states explicitly in the fourth proposition of part 3 of the Ethics, which he has finished by the time he wrote this letter, that, quote, "Nothing can be destroyed except through an external cause," end of quote. This indicates that nothing can have such a nature that harms itself, be it through kidney stones or through inconsiderate behavior. For this reason, I argue that Spinoza uses the term nature equivocally in this passage, not as referring to the individual's singular essence, as in the Blyenberg correspondence, but rather as referring to the actual state of the individual. And now I come to the general conclusions. Martin Sarr in his book emphasizes that Spinoza's philosophy can only be conceived as an emancipatory project if psychology and epistemology are treated as 2 sides of the same project. If my argument is accepted, the shift between Spinoza's early and late vocabulary about sin indicates a shift in Spinoza's metaphysical conception of what is epistemically and psychologically possible, and thereby it indicates a shift in Spinoza's conception of what is humanly possible. Needless to say, such a shift has huge implications for political and social critique. Spinoza's early vocabulary indicates that the possibility of social critique is rather limited, and the means of such critique is exclusion or worse. If the impious is like a poisoned snake, the nature of which necessarily gives rise to harmful action, it is the nature of the impious that is at fault, and the best society can do is to get rid of her. Taking such a vocabulary into account, perhaps it is not surprising that Ernst Haeckel was able to blend Spinoza's philosophy, eugenics, racism, and colonialism into a seamless mixture. By contrast, Spinoza's late vocabulary indicates that the possibility of social critique is far-reaching. If the impious is like a person bitten by a rabid dog, it is the society as a whole that is at fault. In this case, social critique does not consist of getting rid of the person exhibiting dangerous behavior, but of building communities without toxic effects that allow the person to heal herself and exhibit beneficial behavior. Of course, the subject cannot do otherwise, since Spinoza sticks to his determinism. But society could and should do otherwise. Thank you for your kind attention.
Okay, great. I'm just going to take over now. So first of all, let me quickly thank you to Emanuele for moderating, and also to my two co-presenters for their amazing talks. So what I will try in this talk is to explore the politics and power of images and affects by turning to narratives of identity and demonstrate their impact on our strivings and relations. The argument I will present is that the affects we experience, which articulate, of course, our striving for self-preservation, are influenced by the socio-political structures and narratives surrounding us. And those involve the construction of identities and impact the ways in which we perceive ourselves and others. So the ways in which we can be affected and affect, and last but not least, the degree to which we can participate and become active. And finally, I will point at the possibilities for critique of societal structures, which a focus on identity facilitates. So let me start with the first of the two parts of my talk, and I do have to apologize in advance that I will read out this paper without a supporting PowerPoint, but I hope that your concentration will keep on for a little bit longer. So let me start. The world is a messy place. Finding orientation, moving through space and webs of relations is not an easy venture, and yet, as Spinoza tells us, individuals have a sort of inert longing for belonging. Spinoza expresses this in the TP as follows, quote, "Everyone is so constituted by nature that he wants to be reckoned as belonging to his own kind and distinguished from the rest by his origin," end of quote. This longing for belonging articulates the wish of being part of a place, of a story, of something that transcends the boundaries of our own durational and limited existence. It is a wish to be recognized by one's own and distinguished from others. And it is here, I would suggest, where the desire and effective roots of being in communion grow flowers for identity. Spinoza himself does, of course, not specifically elaborate on identity, but several passages in his work speak to this topic and, as I hope to show, spark some insightful thoughts on identity and politics. Spinoza's philosophy suggests that identity is an imaginative product. That means identity is neither the essence of a being nor a source of agency, even though it does influence our desires, passions, and actions, and thereby our ideas and the degree to which we can be active and become free. Identity, I suggest, is an image under construction. More specifically, from Spinoza's perspective, we can think of identity in terms of narratives that guide us through the world and that present ways of understanding oneself and place within one's environment. Framed as narratives, identities are fruits of our imagination, which is, next to rational and intuition, one of the three forms of knowledge that human beings can attain. Spinoza's approach to the imagination is based on the assumption that the object of the human mind is the human body, and that the human mind has an idea of the affections of the body. Our imagination is a form of bodily awareness, and of all three kinds of knowledge, it is most intimately intertwined with affections and experience. Spinoza explains that we gain knowledge of the first kind from signs, from hearsay, or, quote, from singular things which have been represented to us in a way that is confused and without order for the intellect, end of quote. The ideas of our imagination are images that capture the ways in which our body responds and connects to the world around us. They involve who and what affects us, but in a rather confused and indistinct way. In this regard, our imagination is profoundly entangled with our desires, loves and hates, joys and sadness, which indicate an increase or decrease of our power. In other words, the imagination is a form of awareness of our needs, relations, and potential, which is why it is an invaluable part of our coexistence despite its inadequacy. Because when we imagine, we try nothing less than to make sense of the world and our position within it. Part and parcel of our imaginary journey are narratives. Narratives are stories and illustrations, depictions of what we believe to have taken place or remember to have experienced. Narratives provide an image of the past and present and a basis for inferences to the future. Of course, those illustrations can, given their imaginative roots, only be incomplete and inadequate, but the purpose of narratives is to guide by retelling words and depicting deeds, by providing examples and encouragement or warnings. Narratives are inherently ambivalent and fragile, but they are persistent and part of any community's imaginary. Now, to think of identity in terms of narratives allows us to engage them as socially communicated images of belonging that affect the perception of others and the assessment of one's own potential. The advantage of a Spinoza's framework is that it enables us to see the epistemological and affective dimension of identity narratives and, moreover, their impact on our striving for preservation, that is our Conatus. We can delineate the impact of identity narratives on our Conatus in regard to at least two aspects. Firstly, they presuppose a sense of the self that heralds a partial understanding or even misconception of one's own ontological condition and dependence on others. This is at least the case whenever identity is linked to the image of a self that is perceived as a closed-off, coherent entity. From this point of view, identity is entwined with a confused and incomplete conception of selfhood and individuality. In contrast to the completeness of the self, which images of identity suggest, imagining identity is in fact a form of fragmentary awareness. So the first aspect in which identity narratives matter is the conception of the mind's and body's connectedness with other thinking bodies and the creation of imaginary boundaries through images of the self and others. Thereby, their impact not only how, but what we strive to preserve. In other words, by adopting a confused sense of the self and creating imaginary boundaries, we become ignorant towards the fact that selfhood, as well as self-determined action and freedom, are never to be found in isolation, but can only be achieved in relation and through cooperation. And here others might disagree, but I follow specifically a relational reading of Spinoza. The second aspect I would like to highlight is connected to the categories and concepts identity narratives invoke. Identity narratives feed on universal notions such as race, gender, or class. I suggest that Spinoza's understanding of universal notions is valuable as it helps to further portray the imaginary roots and effective charge of identity narratives and categories. Universal notions, not to be confused with the common notions Spinoza introduces as the foundation of our reasoning, are based on passions, random experience, and inadequate ideas, and hence they are ill-founded and often unjustified generalizations. Universal notions can be described as attributions based on images, prejudices, and misconceptions. They do not reveal something true or something individuals would have in common or that would belong to their essence. Quite contrary, universal notions are best understood as fictions. That means as more or less coherent systems of images which are based on experience, memories, and affects. And those fictions are, however, not individual phenomena, but socially mediated images shared by members of a community and therefore fundamental to politics. For our understanding of identity narratives, this means that insofar as they are based on universal notions, they are socio-political constructs embedded within societal structures and imaginaries. One imminent danger of universal notions and consequently narratives of identity are the effective mechanisms and dynamics connected to them. Universal notions set off complex processes of attribution and self-attribution. That means we associate and assign certain characteristics to ourselves and others that contribute to partial and false understandings of our relations, dependencies, and capacities. Consequently, by misunderstanding or misjudgment of ourselves and others, we also misconceive of our loves and hates, of what we find desirable and detestful, of what we take to be empowering and disempowering. Therefore, identity narratives are critical for the organization of our coexistence and interaction, as well as for what we judge to be good or bad. Via universal notions, images of identity ascribe similarities and differences to others, which influence our affective bonds, our associations and dissociations, agreement or disagreement. They are images of belonging and non-belonging that are shared and circulated among socio-political groups. To sum up, the universal notions inherent to identity narratives show that those can create bonds and fractions, agreement and disagreement. The power to create agreement and disagreement of narratives of identity is, for example, also demonstrated in Spinoza's elaborations on ingenium and also on his retelling of the Hebrew state. And maybe we can come back to this in the Q&A, but this would be one example where we can see how certain narratives of identity bring about agreement and disagreement, what I hope to now elaborate a little bit more on in the second part of the paper, where I also try to show the political dimension of identity narratives in more detail. The agreement identity constructs create via social bonds is empowering, as it offers a place in the world, gives meaning, and importantly, at least partially affirms a group of individuals' agreement in nature. However, given the ambivalent character of the social ties narratives of identity create, they not only enable agreement among individuals, but also disable agreement and foster disagreement among those who do not belong or share a certain narrative. Narratives of identity create agreement among those who they include and disagreement with those they exclude. The agreement and disagreement created by identity constructions is primarily imaginative, affective, and of inherently fragile character, but indispensable for the organization of a community. For example, the identification of a multitude as a nation and creation of a national narrative forges a bond and can prevent fractional formations within the body politic. At the same time, not only unifying identity categories such as nationality, but also differentiating constructs such as race, class, or gender, contribute to the organization of political bodies. In addition to seeking avoidance of undesirable fractions or mergers, it can also be part of a state's political agenda to establish artificial differences and associated groupings via socio-political constructs. Narratives of identity thus operate with mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion, domination and suppression, concealment and revelation. This is not to say that identity constructs are inherently bad. They may give an orientation in the world, but they may, however, also foreclose access to a world. Identity constructions can be empowering and disempowering. They can harden the advantages as well as disadvantages of our socio-political position and promote our activity as well as passivity. The relevance of shared and effectively charged, socially shared images like identity narratives results from the often unconscious, almost automated circuits of action, habits, social balances, and effective patterns of reaction they involve. And these are then the background against which political participation, collective action, but also protests and dissent take place. For reasons of time, I will close with some preliminary thoughts and considerations on the possibilities of critique connected to narratives of identity and politics and their meaning for the overall aim of Spinoza's philosophical program, which is to guide us to freedom. And because there's much more to say on this topic, I hope we can deepen this conversation in connection to the other talks and in the Q&A. So, focusing on identity narratives, I suggest opens different ways to formulate a kind of immanent critique of the socio-political structures and regimes that form us and constrain us from becoming more active and participate. Firstly, focusing on identity narratives, the way they shape relations, desires, how they include and exclude, how they position individuals and structure society, helps us to see problematic or even dangerous tendencies, dynamics, and structures in politics and our coexistence. Secondly, we may be able to explore and criticize certain narratives of identity, which, for example, depict the self as an independent, self-sufficient, and closed-off entity, or as superior to others. Moreover, we may find ways to reflect upon privileges, disadvantages, or values connected to certain narratives and identity constructions. Thirdly, to engage with identity narratives in politics also enables us to ask which identity narratives are rendered invisible or hypervisible, whose stories are muted and whose are told. There's different ways towards a form of immanent critique might help us to enhance the ways in which our coexistence is organized so that the body politic as a whole can flourish. It also enables us to ask in how far shared images hinder some or even the whole body politic to become more free and live guided by reason. However, it remains important to highlight the ambivalence of identity narratives. Of course, as fruits of our imagination, they seem to stand in the way to our freedom. We know that for Spinoza, freedom is the power of acting by the necessity of the nature of a thing alone, and that true freedom for human beings depends on fortitudo, so actions guided by the third kind of knowledge, as he states in the Ethics. However, his epistemology and ontology suggests that human freedom is a matter of degree, something we can aspire to but never fully achieve. The true understanding of the world and our place in nature is powerful but hard to attain. Whilst we all have the capacity to truly understand and experience freedom, as effective beings embedded within effective relations, we are mostly guided and absorbed by our imagination. In this sense, our imagination and its bittersweet fruits do not stand in the way of our freedom. Rather, we need to find freedom in light of our affects, of our experiences, and the inescapability of images and relations. Human freedom, in other words, is not about the absence of images and affects, but about living as much as possible guided by reason, and it can be increased by thinking adequately and governing the affects wisely, as Spinoza teaches us. It is precisely in this regard where narratives and politics of identity can also be empowering. In some regards, narratives of identity can contribute to our freedom by providing us with sensible images of the world and our existence as parts of nature. They may also promote reasonable habitual patterns, foster cooperation and agreement, or to dispose us to desire and strive for something truly good for us. Indeed, narratives of identity provide us with an image of the world and can contribute to sensible ways of interaction and decisions about how to live. Nevertheless, as socially shared and embedded images, it largely depends on the politics of identity narratives if they can become a means for freedom or bondage. To briefly sum up what I hope to have shown in this very brief talk is that our intersubjective relations are influenced by identity narratives connected to the societal structures which we are part of. The ambivalent cases of identity narratives in politics, which depict relations between self, others, and power, should be within the reach of any contemporary critique of power that follows a Spinozist approach and engages with political images. To approach the complex of identity and politics facilitates a conception of the force and power of images and can capture the inner psychical as well as interpersonal dynamics they enable and disable, which is of pivotal relevance for the way we coexist in communities. Identity narratives and the way they are engaged in politics have a vital impact on human desires for material and immaterial goods, and are therefore central for the overall question of how we can redirect human desires from goods which hold the subject in bondage. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Marie, and thanks Oliver and Luce for your wonderful talks. All right, so I suppose I should moderate the Q&A. So feel free to either let me know in the chat or raise your virtual hand, and I'll try to keep things as orderly as possible. But in the meantime, I'm going to terminate the recording.